Welcome to This Explainer. Today we're diving into one of the absolute most stunning geopolitical earthquakes of the 20th century, which is, of course, the collapse of the Soviet Union. For decades, it was this colossal superpower. They dominated global politics, space exploration, and military might. And then, in the blink of an eye, it just vanished. We're going to map out exactly why the Soviet Union collapsed, tracking the historical stakes and the sudden, honestly breathtaking dissolution of this massive state.
It's a pretty profound question, isn't it? How does a massive global superpower just disappear overnight? To the outside world in the 1980s, the USSR projected this image of absolute permanence and iron-fisted control. Yet within just a few short years, the sprawling union of 15 republics would completely fracture. It radically altered the map of the world and formally ended the Cold War. To truly understand the sheer scale of this implosion, we really have to look past all that Cold War propaganda and dive straight into the data.
Okay, let's dive into this. We'll track this domino effect across 5 stages: cracks in the foundation, the catalyst of reform, the chain reaction, the final blow, and finally, the devastating fallout.
Part 1. Cracks in the foundation, the era of stagnation.
Long before the dramatic events of the late 80s and early 90s, the USSR was silently bankrupting itself. Beneath the very polished surface, the state was dealing with chronic economic stagnation. They were essentially unable to provide dynamic growth or even basic consumer goods to the people. On top of this, they were carrying the massive financial burden of the nuclear arms race with the United States, alongside incredibly costly foreign conflicts like the Soviet-Afghan War. And internally, well, despite the projection of a unified Soviet identity, there was intense, simmering ethnic nationalism across its 15 constituent Union republics. These compounding structural flaws were essentially a powder keg just waiting for a spark.
Part 2. The catalyst of reform. Enter Mikhail Gorbachev. So, in 1985, Mikhail Gorbachev comes to power, genuinely hoping to save this ailing system. He recognized the dire state of the economy and introduced two absolutely critical policies. First, Glasnost, meaning openness and transparency, and Perestroika, meaning economic restructuring. But here's the supreme historical irony. By actually giving the people a voice and loosening the state's grip to save the system, Gorbachev accidentally exposed all those hidden fractures we just talked about and completely destabilized the entire union.
Part 3. The chain reaction, the parade of sovereignties.
This new openness accidentally lit a fuse. What started as localized protests quickly blossomed into a full-on legislative and political rebellion. In November 1988, Estonia boldly became the first Union republic to declare state sovereignty. This momentum built, and by March 1990, Lithuania took it a massive step further by declaring full independence. This sparked what literally became known as the War of Laws. Local constituent republics began actively rejecting union-wide legislation from Moscow that conflicted with their own local laws. They started asserting control over their own local economies, and in some cases, even refused to pay taxes to the Central Soviet government.
And this brilliantly illustrates that at the very heart of this collapse was a bitter political rivalry. On one side, you have Mikhail Gorbachev desperately attempting to maintain central control and keep the union together on a modified scale. On the other side, Boris Yeltsin rebranded himself as an anti-establishment rebel. Frustrated by the slow pace of reform, Yeltsin rode a huge wave of rising popularity by pushing for the sovereignty of the Russian Republic itself. This 4-year political struggle between these two men was highly destabilizing and played a massive role in the unraveling of the state.
Part 4. The final blow, the climax of 1991.
The tension finally reached a breaking point in the frantic year of 1991. In August, communist hardliners, terrified of losing the Soviet state, attempted a coup to overthrow Gorbachev and reverse his reforms. Well, the coup failed, but the resulting turmoil completely stripped Moscow of whatever remaining influence it had. Events then moved at breakneck speed. By December 1st, a popular referendum saw 91% of Ukrainian voters choose independence. With Ukraine gone, the union was effectively dead. On December 8th, the leaders of Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus met secretly and signed the Belovezh Accords, literally declaring that the Soviet Union had ceased to exist. With its country dissolved out from under him, Mikhail Gorbachev officially resigned on December 25th, transferring his powers, including the nuclear launch codes, to Boris Yeltsin.
All of this chaos culminated in one quiet yet incredibly historic moment. On the evening of December 25, 1991, the iconic red Soviet flag was lowered from the Kremlin for the very last time. It was replaced by the Russian tricolor. The following day, the Soviet Union was formally dissolved by declaration. Just like that, the Cold War was over and the map of the world was forever changed.
Part 5. The devastating fallout, the human cost.
Now, while the political dissolution was incredibly swift, the transition to a capitalist market economy brought staggering consequences for everyday citizens. Observers at the time noted a severe economic crisis and a catastrophic fall in the standard of living, which some actually described as worse than the Great Depression. The sudden transition resulted in truly unprecedented financial devastation. People's life savings were wiped out, supply chains were completely shattered, and the economic safety nets of the former state vanished pretty much overnight.
Now, what's really interesting about this data is that the sheer scale of this economic destruction is hard to overstate. These weren't just standard recessions. They were massive wipeouts of national wealth over the course of a single decade. Between 1990 and 2000, Georgia experienced an unbelievable 78% drop in GDP. Armenia saw a 63% decline. Russia, the largest successor state, saw its GDP plummet by 40%. Across all post-Soviet nations, the GDP decline averaged roughly 51%.
And behind those abstract macroeconomic numbers is a staggering human reality. By the end of the 1990s, the poverty rate in the region skyrocketed from a mere 3% to a whopping 20%. To put that into perspective, that means approximately 88 million people were thrust into poverty, living below the international poverty line. They were trying to survive in a landscape where their currency and their jobs had rapidly, disastrously lost value.
The grim public health and social data really underscores this tragedy. The post-Soviet crisis resulted in an estimated 7 million premature deaths across the former USSR. Russia alone experienced the largest drop in life expectancy during peacetime in recorded history. Societies were left reeling, leading to massive surges in crime as well as drug and alcohol use. Furthermore, as state assets were rapidly privatized, economic inequality spiked dramatically. It sharply divided the population into a tiny fraction of the ultra-wealthy and millions upon millions of struggling citizens. Ultimately, the dissolution of the Soviet Union didn't just redraw borders. It removed communism as a balancing global force, which allowed neoliberal capitalism to become the world's dominant economic system. The shockwaves of that transition, the rapid privatization, and the ensuing inequality set the stage for much of the geopolitical and economic reality we navigate right now. So, I want to leave you with this final thought to consider. How did this sudden shift to global neoliberal capitalism and rising inequality shape the modern world we live in today? Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep questioning, keep learning, and I'll catch you next time.